So we all know autism exists on a spectrum. That's absolutely true and absolutely accurate. But that's not the full picture because it's not just a spectrum of severity or magnitude. It's very importantly a spectrum of visibility as well. And ignoring that fact, ignoring that reality, isn't just a mistake. It's not just unscientific. It's an insult and a disservice to millions of autistic people across North America and the world at large. So when we have people like Donald Trump, RFK Jr., talking about their plans to cure autism, they're not helping us. They're not helping families or people that are affected by autism. They're simply trying to erase us sort of from the gene pool for future generations. On RFK Jr.'s first day at the US Department of Health and Human Services, he talked about how autism is something that destroys families. And then the next day, during his CDC prevalence briefing, he went even further, claiming that autistic kids will never pay taxes, never hold a job, never play baseball, never write a poem, never go on a date, and that many will never even use a toilet unassisted. That's certainly not describing a plan for inclusion or support. That is simply a plan for erasure. So, most people still think of autism framed in a very narrow way. We often picture a little boy diagnosed young, struggling with communication, and needing constant support. But that's not the full picture. That's actually just a snapshot of the group that gets seen, that gets assessed, that gets diagnosed. And according to the CDC, 1 in 36 children are now diagnosed as autistic. That data was last collected in 2023. In the 1970s, it was thought to be 4 in every 10,000 people are diagnosed autistic. So we have RFK Jr., Donald Trump calling this an autism epidemic, with the implication there being that something has gone terribly wrong and we are continuously being poisoned into existence. But the reality of that is that we aren't new. We aren't appearing out of nowhere. We've always been here. And you're just seeing more of us as the world changes. So, autism hasn't been exploding over these last 2 decades, 1 decade, 5 years, whatever. But awareness has, and diagnostic criteria has. Prior to 2013, Asperger's, pervasive development disorder, classic autism were all 3 separate conditions you could be diagnosed with. Sometimes people were diagnosed with multiple, but typically they were solo. In 2013, the DSM-5 collapsed Asperger's, PDD, NOS, and classic autism all under the umbrella of autism spectrum disorder. Okay, so that broader definition finally recognized people who'd been invisible for decades. And certainly it jacked the autism diagnoses way up because it's including what would previously have been considered 3 separate diagnoses. But increased awareness, better screening tools, online resources, and autistic self-advocacy have exposed just how badly we were missing people before. The spike in diagnosis is not an epidemic. It's not some mystery. It's society starting to catch up and medicine changing to encompass a broader spectrum of people. So as I've mentioned, I'm autistic, and like so many others, I didn't fit the old stereotypes. I wasn't obvious. I masked. I adapted. I burnt myself out trying to pass as normal, and I wouldn't say I was fully successful at that, but I was successful enough that nobody ever saw me as disabled. And nobody ever saw the facts that I struggle as anything beyond a character flaw. And for years and years and years, nobody ever saw me. And I know countless autistic adults, some of them brilliant, gifted, incredibly empathetic thinkers who didn't get diagnosed until their 20s, 30s, even their 50s. And those of us who weren't diagnosed until later in life weren't less autistic when we were born. We were just born less visible. We were born invisible, in fact. So autism isn't just about how severe it is, as I mentioned earlier. It's about how obvious it looks to a system built on stereotypes. Autistic people with intellectual disabilities are diagnosed early and frequently. In fact, roughly 31% of autistic people also have an intellectual disability, which means an IQ of 70 or lower. And that is certainly concerning and warrants investigation. But autistic people without intellectual disabilities, especially those with higher IQ levels than average, are systematically overlooked. Why are you going to get your child who has an IQ of 135 tested for neurodiversity or disability? You're not very likely to do that. And this sad fact hits women especially hard. Research suggests that up to 80% of autistic women, and I believe that estimates are actually even higher than that, are undiagnosed as children and remain undiagnosed through adulthood. In many cases, especially with women, many of us get misdiagnosed. ADHD, bipolar disorder, borderline personality disorder, anxiety. These are all common misdiagnoses because professionals are still using outdated models or basing their assessment criteria on stereotypes or how we used to look at things. So when RFK Jr. talks about curing autism, ask yourself, whose autism is he even talking about? Because he's not talking about me, and there are millions of us that he's also not talking about. Now, hold on to that 31% of autistic people having intellectual disability as well, because it's important in just a second here. So here's the thing. When you hear that essentially 1/3 of autistic people have intellectual disabilities, you are hearing something very misleading, because that only reflects the diagnosed visible group. The invisible majority, the masked, the gifted, the entire spectrum of autistic women essentially aren't counted when these statistics are created. If they were, the true percentage of intellectual disability in autism would likely drop by 20%, maybe even to the same rate of occurrence as a non-autistic person. Now, and the reason I say that is because even though autism diagnoses have skyrocketed, the actual number of people with global intellectual disability hasn't actually increased. So that means we shouldn't be wasting time trying to cure autism, because the autism epidemic isn't producing more people with disabilities than it has in the past. That has remained basically static. So we should be studying why intellectual disability, why developmental regression that never kicks back in, why things like that happen in some cases, and how to support those people, instead of simply treating all autistic people like a disease or a societal illness. And if we're talking about causes worth investigating, there's plenty of promising leads that we're ignoring, like studies suggesting that histamine activity in the brain may play a role in sensory regulation, in behavior, in the negative or uncomfortable symptoms of autism. Research into the gut-brain connection that's continuously uncovering links between microbiome health and neurological development and neurological presentation. Even certain dietary interventions like eliminating gluten or dairy have shown measurable benefit for subsets of people across autism, ADHD, celiac, epilepsy, and other conditions. And these correlations aren't definitive, they're not proof causative, but they're all biologically plausible, grounded in evidence, and well worth exploring. And that's where our research dollars should be going, not into recycling disproven conspiracy theories about vaccines or creating a new one about Tylenol. So recently, RFK Jr. and the Trump administration have been pushing the claim that Tylenol use during pregnancy causes autism. And they hang this argument on a single observational study, not peer-reviewed, not a true meta-analysis, based on carefully selected data rather than comprehensive evidence, and a disclosed conflict of interest in said research. And all this carefully selected data was able to do was show a correlation between parents that took Tylenol while pregnant and that child eventually being diagnosed as autistic. Now, I don't know why we have to continuously explain this and where this rise of intellectualism, anti-intellectualism, I should say, has come from, but correlation is not causation. Just because two things happen around the same time, like a parent using Tylenol and their child later being diagnosed autistic, doesn't mean one caused the other. That is just one of millions of potential variables, and those have to be considered as well. So that's why researchers did sibling studies, to control for those otherwise uncontrolled variables. So they looked at families where one child was exposed to Tylenol in the womb and the other was not. If Tylenol had a causative link to autism, you would expect that the exposed child would be autistic more often than the sibling that was not exposed. But that's not what the data showed at all. Once certain variables were accounted for, the autism rates between exposed and non-exposed children were essentially the same. And why is that? Well, that's because siblings share the things that actually matter. They share genetics, they share family health, they share an environment. And when you hold those factors constant, the so-called link to Tylenol completely disappears. So, in other words, it's not Tylenol making the difference. Okay? And that's been observed. It's family background and genetics. Those are the things that matter here. And that's why the World Health Organization, the American Academy of Pediatrics, the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists all agree there is no causal link. See, this isn't just misinformation. It's actually dangerous. It frames autism as a modern tragedy. It distracts from the real progress we've made in recognizing hidden autistic people, and it chips away at science itself, replacing evidence with conspiracy. We're completely ignoring certain statistical truths, such as autistic people have a significantly higher rate of gifted level IQ compared to the general population. And these numbers are actually increasing, whereas those with intellectual disabilities are staying unrelated to the spike in autism diagnoses. So when RFK Jr. vows to eliminate exposures that cause autism, he's not talking about prevention of something that's actively harming society. He's simply talking about erasure. Autism is not a disease. Okay? It is not an epidemic. It is a spectrum. Yes, a spectrum of severity, a spectrum of magnitude, but also a spectrum of visibility, a spectrum of presentation, a spectrum of incredible diversity. The tragedy is not that more people are being diagnosed. That is a good thing, and it speaks to awareness, medicine, assessments, all becoming better at catching those that it used to miss. The true tragedy is that leaders of the strongest nations in the world are willing to weaponize fear and pseudoscience instead of listening to autistic people ourselves, instead of listening to the professionals, the scientists, the doctors, everybody that's been doing the research on this subject for decades. That's where the problem lies. So if you're a person who's felt unseen or who's been mislabeled or constantly misunderstood, you're not the problem and you're not broken. The system wasn't built to see you. That's where the problem began. The real problem, the real tragedy here is that now that things have started to change, this rise of anti-intellectualism, of anti-science, of alternative facts, has stepped in the way to try and invalidate these things. And all I can really say when we look at Donald Trump, RFK Jr., is don't listen to a thing that those clowns say about autism spectrum disorder, about what it means to be autistic, or what it means to be you and who you are. That is for you to decide, not anybody else.